Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're navigating, well, a complex and, frankly, quite revealing area. The presence and influence of psychopathic traits within the corporate world.
Yeah, it's a topic that comes up more and more. We'll be drawing on research and case studies to really try and understand the dynamics here.
It's definitely striking when you look at the numbers. The general population sits at around, what, 1% for these traits?
Roughly 1%, yes. But then you look at the corporate world, especially higher up.
Right, senior leadership roles. And the estimate jumps to 3, maybe 4%. That's a significant difference.
It really is.
Exactly. So our goal in this deep dive is to explore that discrepancy. Why? Why might corporate environments see, a higher concentration of these traits in leadership?
And what are the actual consequences, the real world impacts?
And crucially, what can organizations even do about it? How can they navigate this better?
We should also probably touch on how certain traits, these psychopathic traits, can be, well, mistaken for good leadership qualities.
Deceptively so, right? They might look like strengths initially, maybe even lead to short-term wins.
But mask significant long-term harm. It's a critical distinction.
Okay, so let's start there. Why this higher proportion? Why corporations?
Well, what's quite telling, I think, is how certain traits associated with psychopathy can actually be perceived as advantageous, almost desirable, within many corporate structures.
Like what specifically?
Think about a certain kind of charisma, maybe superficial charm. Then there's skill and manipulation, strategic thinking that's very cold and logical.
Detached, maybe.
Detached, exactly. Plus, a high degree of resilience to emotional pressure, and importantly, a real willingness to take big risks.
It's interesting when you listen like that, because those are often the very things that get people noticed, right? That get them promoted.
Precisely. They can easily be misread as strong leadership. Someone who projects total confidence, makes quick decisions, isn't afraid to shake things up.
They might seem like the ideal candidate on paper, someone who gets fast-tracked.
Exactly. And consider this. The ability to make really tough, unpopular decisions, layoffs, for instance. Someone with these traits might do that without the emotional conflict, the distress that others would feel. And in some corporate cultures, that can be seen as, well, efficient, a strength.
Especially if the main focus is on the next quarter's results, immediate financial returns.
That detached approach looks like strength in tough times, even if it comes from a lack of empathy.
So it paints this picture, kind of a disturbing one, of a corporate ecosystem where lacking empathy could actually be an advantage for getting ahead. For some people, anyway.
It seems that way sometimes.
Okay, to really get a handle on the impact, let's look at some examples. The sources give us quite a few cases, like Enron. That's a big one.
Oh, Enron is a classic, if tragic, illustration. You had executives there, widely described as exhibiting significant psychopathic traits,
Right.
who engaged in massive financial fraud, market manipulation. The absolute priority was boosting short-term profits, inflating that stock price.
With seemingly zero regard for the long-term health of the company. Or ethics.
Seemingly, yes, a blatant disregard. And the fallout was just catastrophic.
Devastating. For shareholders, employees, the wider economy.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just the individuals. The whole corporate culture at Enron became, well, corrupted. It was driven by this relentless demand for performance at any cost, basically.
Regardless of the ethical cost.
Then, if you widen the lens a bit, think about the 2008 financial crisis, the Lehman shock.
Another huge systemic event.
Exactly. Complex causes, of course, but some analyses point to executives in finance who were chasing these incredibly high-risk investments for short-term profits, and again, exhibiting traits linked to psychopathy, contributing significantly to that global meltdown. It wasn't just one company, it had ripple effects everywhere.
And more recently, there was Carillion in the UK. Similar patterns, wasn't it?
Very similar and quite revealing. Executives showing these traits pushed for aggressive expansion, taking on really high-risk contracts.
While misrepresenting the company's financial health.
Yes, exactly. Misrepresenting the finances. The focus was clearly on personal gain, short-term success metrics, not the long-term survival of the company.
And it led to bankruptcy, huge job losses, subcontractors left high and dry.
It really underscores that pattern, prioritizing self-interest and fleeting wins over the collective good and long-term viability.
There's definite thread here, isn't there?
Yeah.
Short-term thinking, ethics out the window, even something like the Wells Fargo fake account scandal.
Right, that might have stemmed more from a toxic, high-pressure culture overall.
Yeah, maybe not pure psychopathy at the very top, but
But it still shows how those environments, those intensely competitive cultures, can allow leaders with those kinds of traits, prioritizing self-interest, disregarding ethics, to really thrive.
and the lack of transparency just made it worse. It allowed it to fester.
Which brings us neatly to the next point. How do these individuals get into positions of power in the first place? The whole evaluation and hiring process.
Right. It seems companies can be surprisingly susceptible. That superficial charm you mentioned, the confidence, the polished self-presentation.
It can be incredibly effective at masking what's really underneath, those problematic traits.
And if the company culture is all about results, results, results,
Then that focus on short-term wins can easily overshadow any deeper look at someone's personality or their ethical compass, especially if they deliver impressive numbers initially.
so traditional hiring, focusing maybe too much on just skills and experience, might miss these critical character aspects.
It often does. They're not designed to adequately assess personality and ethics in that depth.
We mentioned Jeffrey Skilling at Enron earlier. His charisma, that confidence, really helped him climb the ladder despite, well, despite everything that came later.
Absolutely. And Elizabeth Holmes at Theranos is another stark example. Her vision, her presentation style, it was compelling. It drew in huge investments.
Even though the technology fundamentally didn't work.
Exactly. It's not just about getting hired either. It's about getting promoted once you're inside.
Ah, the promotion patterns. That's key too. What strategies do they use to climb?
Well, the sources point to a few recurring things. That charm and self-presentation are still crucial, of course.
Foundational.
Yes. But then you often see calculated manipulation of colleagues, maybe taking credit for others' work, undermining rivals, a willingness to make really bold, sometimes reckless decisions that get attention, and even faking empathy using emotional manipulation strategically.
Wow. That's quite the toolkit. Destructive, but potentially effective in certain environments.
So potent, yes. And again, if the corporate culture mainly rewards results measured in the short term.
Then people willing to cut ethical corners or manipulate others might actually look more successful, at least for a while. The system itself can end up rewarding the wrong behaviors.
Sadly, yes. You see it in cases like Bernie Madoff. He used that cultivated charm and trustworthiness to run a massive Ponzi scheme for decades.
Incredible.
Or Georg Christescu manipulating his way up through financial frauds. Or Raja Kumar, known for boosting profits rapidly with super bold strategies.
But with terrible long-term consequences for the companies involved.
Precisely. It always comes back to that short-term versus long-term tension.
And what does this do to the overall health of the organization? The culture, employee engagement?
The impact there is huge. Those really competitive, non-transparent work environments, they can be breeding grounds for this kind of leadership.
Fertile ground, you said.
Yeah. And once these individuals gain power, they can really poison the well. They start prioritizing their own interests, maybe bending or breaking rules, and that sets a tone. It cascades down.
So unethical behavior becomes normalized, maybe even implicitly encouraged?
It can, and that inevitably crushes employee engagement. When people feel manipulated, unsafe, undervalued, their motivation just tanks. Their commitment disappears.
Psychological safety goes out the window.
Completely. Look at the Tesco accounting scandal. That involved manipulative leadership, intense pressure for short-term results.
And after the scandal broke,
Employee engagement plummeted. Trust was shattered. Surveys showed people felt unfairly evaluated, deeply dissatisfied with leadership. It's a direct link.
which leads us to another critical area, decision-making and risk management. How does this leadership style affect those core functions?
Well, the sources are pretty consistent here. Leaders with these traits often lack transparency in how they make decisions.
They keep things close to the vest.
Very close. They also tend to downplay risks or ignore them altogether, especially if acknowledging risk might slow down those immediate gains they're chasing.
Which obviously puts the company's long-term future in jeopardy.
Absolutely. And there's that tendency to marginalize anyone who disagrees, dismiss dissenting views. Decisions often get made unilaterally.
Without consultation.
Often, yes. And then, when things go wrong, as they inevitably do with risky, non-transparent decisions.
Let me guess. They don't take responsibility.
Rarely. The pattern is deflection, blaming others, avoiding accountability.
Which ties directly into the ethical problems, doesn't it?
It's the core of it, really. These leaders can systematically erode a company's ethical foundations by putting personal gain first and creating a culture where unethical acts are tolerated.
They create a really toxic environment.
Exactly, and the fear and pressure they generate can push employees to compromise their own values just to survive or keep their jobs.
So the whole culture shifts. Short-term profits become the only thing that matters. Ethics fall by the wayside.
And when those ethical breaches eventually come to light, the damage to the company's reputation, its social credibility, its brand, it can be immense and lasting.
Okay, so let's bring it all together and talk about the bottom line. Corporate performance. Does this type of leadership actually work, even in the short term?
Well, that's the deceptive part. There can be periods of what look like strong short-term results.
Right, the numbers might go up initially.
Exactly. But our sources really emphasize that these gains often mask huge underlying risks and a complete lack of long-term vision.
Because the risk management is poor, the focus is only on the immediate.
And the damage to the culture, morale, trust, it all undermines sustainable growth. Real, lasting success needs careful risk management, a long-term view, transparency, ethical foundations, things these leaders often neglect or actively destroy.
So the million-dollar question then, how can organizations spot these individuals? And what can they actually do about it? It sounds incredibly difficult.
It is challenging, no doubt, but not impossible. The sources suggest focusing on observable behaviors, looking for patterns,
Like?
excessive manipulativeness, extreme self-centeredness, watching day-to-day interactions. Is there a consistent indifference to others' feelings? Does the empathy seem switched on and off like a performance?
Superficial charm masking that indifference.
Yes. And using things like multi-source feedback 360-degree evaluations can help get a fuller picture beyond just what the person presents upwards.
Get perspectives from peers, subordinates.
Exactly. Also, simply increasing transparency in business processes and how decisions are made can make it harder for manipulative behaviors to succeed unnoticed.
Sunlight being the best disinfectant kind of thing.
Sort of, yes. And actively cultivating a strong ethical culture is paramount. Leadership training shouldn't just be about strategy. It needs to focus on ethics, empathy.
Plus, having strong whistleblower policies. Safe, anonymous ways for people to raise concerns.
Absolutely crucial. Creating an environment where people feel safe to speak up about problematic behavior is key.
What about the overall environment? Less cutthroat competition.
Fostering collaboration, valuing teamwork over just individual wins, that can help shift the dynamics away from favoring purely self-interested behavior. But fundamentally, it requires ongoing vigilance.
Right. You can't just do a checkbox exercise during hiring.
No, it's about sustained monitoring, evaluating behavior patterns over time, looking beyond the surface achievements.
Okay, so let's try and summarize this deep dive. We've looked at this, well, worrying overrepresentation of individuals with psychopathic traits in corporate leadership.
Yeah, and we've explored some reasons how these traits can be mistaken for leadership qualities, especially in cultures obsessed with short-term results.
And we've really dug into the risks. The damage to ethics, to culture, to long-term sustainability. It's significant.
It really underscores how what looks like decisive leadership can actually be incredibly destructive down the road.
It makes you really question the systems, the cultures in our organizations.
Yeah.
Are we inadvertently rewarding these damaging traits?
That's the hard question.
It highlights how vital it is to evaluate leadership much more deeply. Look beyond the charisma, beyond the quick wins.
Which leaves us with, I suppose, a final thought for reflection, maybe for everyone listening.
Yeah.
How can we, perhaps in our own spheres of influence, consciously build organizations that prioritize genuine ethical leadership, that value transparency, long-term well-being for everyone involved?
Instead of just being swayed by that potentially dangerous allure of short-term gains, often driven by a very specific and sometimes harmful personality type.
Exactly. How do we build healthier, more sustainable organizations from the leadership down?